quite sure where I should be, but I'll sit here.
Well, they're not kidding. These lights really are bright. There is a room there, I suppose. Okay, well, thank you, everybody, for joining this session. Thank you to Sedex for the opportunity to put this on. Thank you to the panelists who are going to explain to you who they all are after I've run through some introductory stuff. And it will not take a genius to realize that we're all male. So hopefully I will refer you to Mark's earlier responses, and we'll talk about SDG 5 later. So, okay, normally when I speak about the SDGs, I need to explain to the audience what they are, but I'm going to make, I think, what is not a particularly huge leap to assume that all of you in this room know what they are. Does anybody want to admit that you don't? Very bravely? No? Okay, fair enough. Starting off then, what a number of speakers have talked over the course of the last couple of days about the four-pillar model and how Sedex delivers against the four-pillar model. I've noticed a few of you taking photographs of that slide. You will notice it is slightly contrived. It's not quite as direct a link as I've implied by putting those up there, but it's not unreasonable, I think, to look at that and show that there is a reasonable link between the formation of the SDGs and the four-pillar model. And that's no particular surprise, given the heritage of all of those things. Separated down at the bottom, number 17, partnerships for the goals, because it's effectively it's not a goal in itself, it's a support mechanism for the other 16. And when you look at what most corporate entities are doing, and there is progressively more of this reporting going on, they will tend to talk very much at high levels. They'll talk at goal level rather than target level, and you will all know that there are 169 targets, many of them couched in terms that are focused around national government wording or political wording rather than economic or corporate wording. But there certainly is a move towards it. Those of you who were here for Trevor's talk yesterday may have seen a little postcard he left. You're seeing more and more linking of the SDGs to various organizations' activities. They're about 20% of the way through their life now, up to 2030, starting to gain traction, 50% FTSE 100 companies and so forth, and more reporting against them, or at least linking what they're already doing to the SDGs. The challenge, I think, is going down to the next level. If you do something with water and just saying it's something to do with SDG 6, that's fine. But in fact, if you look at the next level, there is a bit more detail than that, albeit couched in ways that perhaps are not directly helpful. So, they're all interconnected, and again, you don't need me to tell you this. I do wander around, sorry. If you're talking about delivering decent work and economic growth, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. You need things like gender equality and sustainable communities. You need decent education for people. You need clean energy to support that economic growth. So it doesn't sit in isolation. They're not 17 or 16 and a bit different things. They are one thing looked at from a number of different directions. So if you take that, fantastic animation there. Once you've got decent work and economic growth, arguably, decent work is one of the things that supports, number one, no poverty. If people are in work, we talked about before, there's not necessarily an immediate link, but if people are in work, better chance that they'll be escaping poverty. If they escape poverty, there's a better chance they will enjoy good health and well-being. If there is good health and well-being, then that means that having food supports that. In order to deliver zero hunger, you need to look after life on land, so farming and agriculture can be effective and people can be given food. Climate action, because climate change disrupts agriculture. Decent communities, people working together, sustainable cities, actually a lot of effort going on in the world. Again, as this audience will know, cities and corporations are leading in terms of climate activities and climate action. So that is then something which is necessary perhaps to support mitigation of climate change. And if we're going to have sustainable communities, then we need responsible consumption and production. And if we have that, those of you who are from the UK will have seen all of the coverage in the press over the course of the last few months about ocean plastics. It's a big issue. We will also know that 90% of ocean plastics enter the oceans through 10 river systems, none of which are in Europe. So this is a global challenge, 2 in Africa, 8 in Asia. So whilst we might do stuff in Europe, actually we need to help organizations to address the challenges in other parts of the world. And sometimes those challenges are due to lack of municipal activity. I heard a statistic recently that in Egypt, and I'm sure it's not unusual in that regard, only 20% of domestic waste is collected by municipal authorities, which means that the public at large or the weather systems have to deal with the rest. So if you look after life underwater, you need quality education to let people in the need to look after the seas, and that brings us back around to good work and economic growth again. So they're all linked. I've happened to have chosen those for no other reason than I could make it work on a slide and fly them all in. You could draw any other sort of variations of different goals supporting others. It's a 16/17 dimensional thing. I wasn't here yesterday morning. I understand that Jonathan trailed this session, so thank you, Jonathan. I was at Westminster for the launch of the British Retail Consortium's new initiative, Better Retail, Better World, which is framed around 5 of the SDGs, which they believe are mostly core to retail. There's more detail below it. You can see that on the BRC website. This is not particularly a puff for the BRC. The people across, you've got the chair of BRC, you've got the retail minister, you've got Baroness Young, who hosted the event, Tanya Steele from WWF, who've been supporting BRC in developing their work. So you've got large organizations. They represent, amongst food and grocery, they represent all of the big players. And in terms of UK food sales, you've already got way more than 50% of UK food sales, grocery sales, represented in companies that have signed up to this. So there's a big multi-stakeholder initiative framed around the SDGs, those particular 5, with targets sitting beneath them. So it's getting more and more traction. So what we're doing at Sedex then is working on providing Sedex members with some support that makes it perhaps a bit more real in operation at an operational level. Those of you who were in the previous session will all have sat next to or on a copy of this, which effectively is the kind of thing we're aiming towards. Guidance on, in this particular case, modern slavery. In this particular case, we're talking about case studies which will help people get into real-world actions that are supporting of the SDGs, framed in a way that makes sense for businesses. We've got a couple of examples here. They go further down. That's not the entire case study. That's just the headline, and there's more stuff. And we have a panelist from Mondelez who's no doubt going to talk a little bit about that. And another one there relating to SDG 3. And what we're also going to do is show how they are interlinked and how other SDGs will be impacted by the activities that are represented in the case studies. And this is a call to all of you in the audience. If you work for organizations that are doing things and you would like work you're doing represented in these case studies or in a library of case studies, then please get in touch through your account manager, and they'll put you in touch with Ellie Neal, who's managing the collation and curating all of the case study work that's going to go behind it. And the goal will be, whether it's in printed form or electronically, there will be documents like this that help relate SDGs and the real world. Oops. So we have a question. Can we run the question now? Obviously, oh, there you go. It was me after all. So on your apps, please, those of you who've downloaded it, could you just answer that question, please? And effectively, we're asking you to answer on behalf of your employer, because I'm going to guess that all of you as individuals will know all about this stuff. Okay. I wonder how many responses that actually... Oh, we're still moving. That looks suspiciously like only 4 people have replied. Oh, it's getting better. That's probably 9. I can't do the arithmetic now to work out how many people that is. Okay. So, broadly speaking, around half of the people in the room are on that horrible word journey and are doing something but haven't yet got it really moving. About 1 in 5 aren't there yet, and about 1 in 3 are doing stuff. So hopefully that demonstrates that we're on the right course in terms of providing some support around the SDGs. If you haven't clicked, keep clicking. We'll leave that up there. What I'll do now is to take you through the panel for no particular reason. They've seated themselves the way that they are. So we'll start at the far end with Oliver from Manufacture 2030, then Jonathan and Andy will talk a little bit about themselves, their organizations, their engagement with the SDGs. Whilst they're doing that, do please think of questions, either submit them through the app or stick your hands up when they finish speaking, because this is about engagement with you and Sedex members. It's not just about four blokes on a panel pontificating. So, Oliver, you first.
Thank you, Gavin. I'm Oliver Hurrey. I'm from 2 Degrees, and we run Manufacture 2030. You may have seen us downstairs, and we mentioned yesterday, someone said earlier we're an oasis of improvement in a room full of auditing, which I don't think there's a problem with auditing at all. But that was interesting to see that described like that. So 2 Degrees is 10 years old in about a week's time, and fundamentally our mission really is to try and accelerate and scale cost, risk, and impact coming out of global supply chains. And we've always believed the best way to do it is through supplier self-improvement. And you can help suppliers self-improve through collaboration. And it's the collaborative bit, particularly when it comes to the SDGs, that is very important to us. A year ago, we launched Manufacture 2030. And the 2030 bit obviously points towards the SDGs. And we felt the SDGs finally, after many, many years of people hoping and praying for a framework that they could finally hang on to, had arrived. And Manufacture 2030's mission is very clear. We want to try and halve the amount of resources used in manufacturing in the next 10 years until 2030, which ties in with obviously SDG 7 around energy and renewable energy, 12 sustainable consumption and production, 13 climate action. But it's number 17 that we get quite passionate about, 2 Degrees, and I think sometimes gets missed, which is about the importance of partnerships and collaboration, because it sort of sits alone as an odd SDG on its own. The importance of collaboration to achieve these goals, the importance of, if you don't know how to do something, go and talk to other companies or other partners who do, and it's perfectly fine to do that. And that's a big part of what we do with Manufacture 2030. We enable factories, suppliers, companies to be able to learn from what the best factories and what the best suppliers are doing. It doesn't involve consultants or auditors or anyone else who's coming into your factory to tell you what to do about the SDGs or anything else. And we firmly believe, and I think this has been our experience, that the SDGs can be achieved and people can learn even about the SDGs themselves by doing things like this and actually hearing what other people are doing. What I have done, which we can touch upon later, in the last few days, is crowdsourced our network with this question about what people know about the SDGs and what they're doing. And there's been a number of resources that have come through, about 30 or 40 different resources came through. So I'll write a blog after this and you can all have a look at it, and I might mention a couple later. But that's what we're doing, and I would particularly highlight number 17, working partnership and collaborating.
Thank you. Jonathan.
Thanks. So I'm Jonathan Horrell. I'm Director of Global Sustainability at Mondelez International. If you haven't heard of Mondelez International, we're a global snacking company with operations across the world. Big presence in biscuit category and chocolate category, as well as some other categories. If you haven't heard the company name, then you will have heard of one or all of Cadbury, Milka, Toblerone, Oreo, or Lou Biscuit, as well as some other brands. So we're a company better known for our brands than our company name. We've existed since 2012 in our current form. My role is to bring together a sustainability strategy within the business and implement it, and also to engage externally with stakeholders and others about that. I'd say perfectly bluntly, I'm not a student of the SDGs, and I think for us, this sustainability and our strategy and what we're trying to achieve isn't an exercise in theory. We base the actions that we have on insight, and those insights will range from what our stakeholders tell us, sometimes in private, sometimes in public, based on what our consumers tell us, and they have very interesting views about how these things fit together and how they see them. What data tells us, and those data might be from our environmental life cycle analysis, which we've been doing since about 2010. They might be about social insights, particularly in upstream supply chains, which are often quite hard to track, by the way. But we're looking to find better and smarter ways of understanding where those impacts are. And the actions that we develop from that range of insights focus on two main elements of our supply chain. And this reflects the type of business that we are, right? We're a snacking company, so we buy agricultural raw materials from all over the world. They're brought to our factories. We manufacture them into products. We distribute those products to retailers, and consumers buy them. They tend to unwrap them and eat them, right? And that unwrapping and eating thing is quite important, right? So there's very little environmental impact downstream from our perspective because they're ready-to-eat products. They don't need refrigeration typically. They don't use water in the consumption. Do you see what I mean? And so what actually happens is our funnel is very much upstream. And so we have two main focus areas in our sustainability strategy. One is focused on our own operations, because obviously the impacts are significant and it's within our direct control. On almost all the rest of it focuses upstream on agriculture. And we source a lot of tropical raw materials, cocoa, sugar, palm oil, nuts, other oils, as well as a lot of wheat, which is also significant in our strategy. And so our goals focus on our environmental impact, a lot of it in operations, but also on building a more sustainable agricultural supply chain. I'm proud to say we won an award last night for our Cocoa Life program. I'm also delighted that it was flashed up on the screen. And I think that indicates, what I'm saying is that when you look at the actions on the ground that result from all of that, you just find that in real life they match many of the priorities that exist in the SDGs. Within Cocoa Life, there are problems within West African supply chain, and this was in our submission for the award around child labour. Those problems, if you look at what the root causes are, child labour is an issue in West Africa. It's an issue in West African agriculture. One of the drivers is poverty. Again, poverty is an issue in West African agriculture. One of the other drivers is that poverty leads people to be unable to employ workers on decent terms so they get their kids to help. One of the other drivers is that it's traditional for families to encourage the kids to help out on the farms. By the way, it's traditional the world over. I grew up on a farm and I helped on it, but I did it under conditions that were beneficial to me. And therefore, you need to address the sensitization issues as well and understand what the root causes are. That means you need to be addressing income from cocoa farming. You need to be addressing other sources of income. You need to be addressing women's empowerment, because when women have more control over finances and decision making within households, you tend to find that the children are more likely to go to school and be properly fed and looked after. You need to address community sensitization, and I deliberately come to it last. You need to identify and remediate cases. And I say it that way round because if you don't address the root causes and all you do is go in to look to identify and remediate the cases, what you'll find is a constant stream of cases coming that you're remediating. You're not actually tackling the issue at source. So all of this comes together in a range of priorities which map neatly against the SDGs. And like I say, when I was a student of it, so we didn't frame our goals in that way, partly because of timing about when we developed the goals, but we now report where there is alignment. And I've got a little list. There's about 8 or 9 goals within the 17 where we think there's alignment with some of our programs around this broader strategy.
Thank you. Before I come to you, Andy, can I just ask you to put the questions up on the big screen as well, please, so that the audience can see them. Right. For those of you that can't see it, which I suspect is most of you, Andy has come armed with a wonderful lapel badge of the SDG logo. So he's certainly dressed to the part, puts the rest of us to shame. Andy, over to you.
Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Greetings from the United States. I'm excited to be here with all of you and with a couple of my colleagues from our P&G London office here as well. I have the privilege of leading what we call our Supplier Citizenship Program. And I'll give you a couple minutes of context of exactly what that means, because I think it'll help as we go through the question and answer dialogue today. At P&G, we exist to serve the world's consumers and improve their lives. We have about 5 billion consumers globally, and like Mondelez, we do that through brands that you all probably know, like Pampers and Ariel and Head & Shoulders. About a year and a half ago, we declared something called our Corporate Citizenship Strategy. And citizenship, simply put, is our framework to be what we call a force for good and a force for growth. We've been doing work in these areas for a long time, but we recognize both a business imperative and a responsibility to be more intentional and to be more vocal about the work we do in 5 priority areas that we defined for our citizenship agenda. And those 5 priority areas are environmental sustainability, ethics and corporate responsibility, community impact, gender equality, and diversity and inclusion. You can already see how they start to line up with the SDGs. And so my job of supplier citizenship, I sit in our purchasing organization. I report to our chief purchasing officer, and I'm responsible for how we interface with our 45,000 global suppliers and collaborate with them, Oliver, back to your point about the importance of SDG 17, to advance our corporate citizenship agenda together. And I'm already excited about some of the questions that I see up here, which we can give some examples on as we go along, but that's a summary of who I am and my responsibility.
Thank you very much. And okay, more questions have miraculously appeared. Somebody, thank you for typing War and Peace, and that massive, great long screen there. So well done, you. Keep the questions coming. We'll get through as many as we can. Somebody at the back of the room, hopefully, is going to wave a number at me, or jump up and down, or shout, or blow a klaxon when we run out of time, because we're between one coffee break and another. So I'm sure you must be thirsty and hungry already after the first one. So the question at the top, the one that has come up. I guess we'll go back on the panel in reverse order, because Andy's already referenced this. Use of SDGs as a scorecard and progress measurement. You've dived straight in there, wanting to comment. So would you like to pick up on that one?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, Oliver, I'm going to come back to a point you made as well, or a word you used, which is framework. And I think that's the importance of the SDGs. They provide a framework, or what I would call a common language, for us to talk about things we're doing across our companies and organizations. And so again, in my job, I interface with our 45,000 global suppliers. They all have different agendas, but through the SDGs, we can talk a common language. We can figure out how we can collaborate in a different way. And so as we think about the idea of scorecarding, there's an internal element to this. So if I look at our company, Procter & Gamble, there are things that we do internally to drive these different sustainable development goals. I actually have a document right in front of me here. You can see some of the colors on it that we use internally, where we map out all the different work we're doing in our corporate citizenship agenda directly to the 17 SDGs. There are some, as you can imagine, that we are taking a more active approach in than others, but it's a way for us to map it. To take that a step further and to drive systemic change, we're also now using the SDGs as a framework and language to scorecard our supply base. And so just last year, we for the first time issued our corporate citizenship scorecard to our top suppliers, where we took a look at with our supply base, not only some of the traditional metrics we would have mapped with them in terms of environmental sustainability, renewable energy, and water usage, we also took a look at the SDGs, we took a look at our citizenship framework, and we said, let's also start to track our suppliers on metrics around gender equality, diversity and inclusion, community impact. And now it becomes a much more holistic way for us to engage, and as I said, not just track and measure, but to figure out where there's opportunities for us to collaborate and advance as well.
Thank you. Jonathan, I guess Cocoa Life has some element of that within it.
Yeah, and obviously reporting is really important, and something we talk about a lot is the need to drive measurable progress on the ground. And if you're going to measure something, then you should be reporting it. And that is not as opposed to compliance with rules, but it's definitely something different, and I think it's more meaningful. So in principle, tracking impact against the SDGs is a very good thing to do. Where I caution is, please don't just add another framework. Please think very carefully about how many metrics you want us to measure. And please think really carefully about how reporting through existing frameworks can contribute to some kind of scorecarding exercise on SDGs. So an obvious example is, like most or many big companies, we report to CDP, carbon and water. So there should be, the reporting in that should be contributing to, and I'm not a student, right, so I have to read it, 6, clean water, and 13, climate action. So, keep it simple.
Okay, right. Oliver?
Yeah, when I said we're delighted that we finally got a framework, you can equally say we don't need another framework. I think it's safe to say whenever you talk to suppliers, they have enough frameworks, enough scorecards, enough surveys, enough data inputs, and forever, unfortunately, supply chains can be providing information and never getting any useful info or value back. And that's something that I think is a really important thing for our clients like Mars and Co-op. It's how can you help those suppliers to improve rather than just providing another way of measuring and scorecarding how heavy the pig is, if you want to use the analogy from yesterday. So I think what's really important is that the SDGs can provide a framework for that, but one of the things that we found is really important is to be able to make it easy for suppliers to digest and make them want to use a scorecard, make them want to use the SDGs, and make them want to use the resources you're providing. Not because it's an easier way of giving you data, not because it's an easier way of getting compliance, because it actually helps them. One of the biggest reasons why supply chains don't make improvements on things like the SDGs is they don't have the knowledge, the capacity, or the capability. They don't have sustainability managers, they don't often have energy managers, etc., etc. So a scorecard's great, and SDGs are good for benchmarking, but much better to provide them with the valuable information to help them improve, not just to make it slightly easier to weigh the pig, if you like.
Okay, and I think just picking up on those points from the Sedex perspective, one of the things about auditing is it generally looks for what is below the baseline rather than what is above the baseline. So what we're looking for here and what we're trying to deliver through the case study mechanism is effectively to crowdsource practice which is above the baseline. So it's additive stuff, it's beyond pure compliance. This is stuff that people are doing that may not be captured by an audit particularly, but if all of us in the room and all the other Sedex members around the globe add to the knowledge base the things that are being done that are supporting some of the targets that sit below the SDGs, things that are meaningful for corporations to do rather than for governments to measure it at national or regional level, then we will all have the opportunity to benefit from each other's knowledge and make improvements. So that's what we're trying to achieve through this, and you will all be playing a part in that, I hope. Just to remind you about the case studies to get in touch with your account managers. Okay, next question up. Where does the responsibility lie in terms of educating the general public, educating citizens about the SDGs and their importance? Certainly in the UK, for those of you who live here, over the last few months, the BBC have taken played quite a significant part in education around ocean plastics. Now, we all know ocean plastics has been an issue for a long time, but for whatever combination of circumstances, it's risen to the top of public consciousness and is now driving action by the UK government. So that's a kind of civil society, governmental response. Didn't come directly from citizens, and corporations are taking action on plastic waste now. However, that's just one simple example. So I guess starting back from Andy, back down the row again, who should be doing what?
Well, for me, the answer to that question is absolutely. We have a role to educate consumers, and I'll pick up on this theme of ocean plastic, which has been talked a couple times already, because I think it's just a really good way, from a story standpoint, to bring to life how this actually can manifest itself. We have a vice president of global sustainability at P&G named Virginie Helias, and I love quoting Virginie on this. She talks about the role that we have as a company like Procter & Gamble to leverage brand innovation and brand communication to help provide education. And maybe it's not specifically on here or what the SDGs are, but it's on advancing the SDGs. So the example I want to share briefly here is our Head & Shoulders beach bottle that some of you might be familiar with. And so to this point about beach plastic, about a year ago, a little over a year ago, we made an announcement at the World Economic Forum in Davos that we were going to issue in France, this happened last summer, it's already out, we are going to issue the world's largest run of recyclable bottles made in part from beach plastic. And it was our way, through both the brand innovation and the way we communicated that work, to be able to drive systemic change around marine plastic. Now, is one bottle, is one package going to drive a complete difference? Maybe not that package, but the fact that we are creating an industry and we're creating the opportunity to do that. We're making people aware. Now, this is a way we're helping consumers, right, make better decisions around this. And because we're P&G, we can leverage that same technology. And so what started as the Head & Shoulders bottle in France, in Carrefour this past summer, a very similar product is going to be launched through our Hurrey brand right here in the United Kingdom later this year. We can start to take this to other regions, to other brands, and that's the really exciting part. Linking it back to the SDGs, it's a direct link, obviously, to SDG 14, Life Below Water. It's a direct link to SDG number 12, responsible consumption, driving responsible consumption. But I also want to stress it's a direct link to SDG 17 as well. Again, my world is interfacing with suppliers. We didn't say, hey, we want to create a plastic beach bottle, who can do that? We got the key supplier partners around in a room with all of our key folks in marketing, research and development, et cetera, and said, how do we solve the fundamental problem of marine plastic in a way that we can speak to our consumers? So much of this, as we're trying to solve problems and as we're trying to educate consumers, is making sure we're engaging the right external partners and making sure we're asking the right question.
Thank you. Jonathan.
I just think people don't think of the SDGs when they're in the supermarket. In that framework, I think what people think about when they're in the supermarket is, am I going to enjoy this, and is the price right? You've got a significant proportion of consumers who are also, to varying degrees, concerned about what happens behind that product. And they're interested and concerned, and you can engage them on key topics. One thing I think is really important is that you don't drive people to solve one of the SDGs at the same time. And I'll comment also on plastic because the question was addressed actually to me, so I'd better say something. But don't fix the plastic problem by stopping using plastic, because if we wrap everything in paper, we'll increase food waste, right? And food, the ingredients in the food has 10 times the environmental impact as the packaging that surrounds the food. So be very careful and be holistic and remember it as a package. Great to increase people's awareness in general of the things that the SDGs are trying to achieve and engage people in that story. But we won't do it by getting everybody to learn a list of 17 goals.
Oliver.
Yeah, I think again with frameworks and particularly in sustainability, well, there's always going to be cynics who will say it's not right, we need to tear it down, it's broken, it's they'll always pick at it. I think we've run out of time for picking at these things. I think it's absolutely the right one to get behind. And marketing organisations and marketing teams love a framework, love an angle to market on. And I think the only challenge there, of course, is that marketing and the teams in brands will obviously want to do something different and creative around the SDGs. And the SDGs are written very much with governments in mind as much as companies, arguably even more so, I would suggest. And I think it's everyone's responsibility, government, NGOs, companies, to really push the SDGs as a really proud framework that the planet can be proud of. And I think it's then for brands to be creative around those SDGs, to find their ways of adding a different dimension to them on top of them. But let's go for it with this framework because, I think it's about time.
I would echo that, and I think actually when you talk about access to consumers, citizens, the BRC launch I mentioned earlier got a fair amount of press coverage, and if you Google that launch, you'll see it's appeared on the websites of all sorts of obscure local, what would have been newspapers back in the day, but are now e-papers, I suppose, around the UK. You wouldn't necessarily expect the Herefordshire Post to pick up a news story about the SDGs, but maybe with Staffordshire, but anyway, some small local newspaper. So in some way, that's piqued people's interests enough within the journalism sector that they're now broadcasting that to people. We still have 80% of the life of the SDGs to run, so we haven't got anywhere near the end game yet. So I think there is still time for people to engage, and if we all start talking the same language, and back to Andy's earlier point, if we all use the same words about the same things, then there is a much greater chance it will stick with consumers, I think. Right, now then, we're running short of time. We won't have time to get to all of those questions. There are probably some running off the bottom of the page, so I will ask, before we go to the next question, I'll ask the panelists if they're okay, that anything we can't get to, we will all provide a written response that will be available through the Sedex website to all the ones that we couldn't address on the panel. So those of you who asked your questions, at least you'll get an answer, albeit perhaps not in the room today. So nobody said no. I'll take that as a yes. It's like democracy, but marginally different. Okay, so the third question is basically, what about the laggards? Oliver.
What about the laggards? Right, okay. Well, I think it does tend to be the same companies around the table. Having been to 1 million sustainability conferences, it tends to be the same companies on the stage, sadly as well, the same people. But I think there is some phenomenal stuff happening in supply chains and in companies that don't have people who can stand on stage and don't have people in marketing teams who can tell their stories as eloquently. But there's some phenomenal stuff going on. I think it's really important that, well, again, from our experience, that you use technologies, you use collaboration in order to surface up good practice, good ideas and things that are happening. In our supply chain programs, for instance, with Co-op and others, we found that 80% of the challenges that factories and suppliers face in tackling SDGs such as environmental SDGs and energy, water and waste, 80% of the problems they have in that factory have been solved already by another factory somewhere in that supply chain. And that's not solved by the brand at the top or the retailer at the top shouting about what they're doing in their supply chain. That's solved by sharing what's specifically happening in specific companies, often quite small companies around the world. So I think it's about trying to, again, give a voice to the masses. I always find when you come to conferences, who decides that we should stand on stage? There's much more knowledge sat there. And I think the more that we can use technology, probably, I would say that, to surface that knowledge from smaller companies and perhaps people who are less brave, the more we'll achieve around the SDGs. Now, again, I'll come back to that Number 17, it's about partnerships. Companies must work together to do that. I think that sort of answers it. I couldn't read it that fast.
This question gets to the absolute heart of the matter. We talk a lot internally about sector-wide change. In supply chains, raw material supply chains, if there's an issue that needs to be fixed, very often the way people come at it is from a perspective of they want to say not guilty, first of all. And therefore what they do is they exclude the bad guys. And all the brands exclude the bad guys, and actually all that can happen and nothing at all can change on the ground. Yeah. And so if we're going to implement SDGs and make change happen, we must work across sectors. We must work with the governments and the other organisations who influence what actually happens on the ground, so that where one change happens, it actually happens across the sector as a whole. And most of the issues around labour rights, around environmental problems, in particular deforestation, are never going to be fixed without that partnership with governments. And we're starting to learn to do that across the consumer goods sector, and we need really to scale up that and make it happen a lot quicker. Hence the need for partnership.
Okay. And Andy?
I think collaboration can happen in different ways. Part of it is when you have like-minded organizations coming together, that is important. But I think to build on Jonathan's point, when I look at some of the large corporations that are here, or Mondelez and P&G that are at part of this panel, there's also a responsibility that we have to bring others along on that journey, to lift as we climb, so to speak. And so I'm going to touch on this piece really quickly on the consumer element of this, because I think it's a great part of this question. And again, another example tied in this case to SDG number 5, gender equality. We have a program that's a few years old through our brand Always, that some of you might have seen before, called #LikeAGirl. Now this is what I mean when I talk about leveraging brand communication and brand innovation. In this case, here's an opportunity, an example where we put together this series of videos that have been viewed over 500 million times globally at this stage, and 19% of people that before they watch one of these videos have a negative perception of the term like a girl. That changes to 76%. Having a positive perception after watching this video. It's us driving systemic change, and even though that's us starting it, we believe that's going to help others come along on the journey with us. And so our consumers fickle, potentially, but if we really believe in this, and I'm not just talking P&G, I'm talking all of us collectively, as a business imperative, in addition to a responsibility, we can together and collectively, back to SDG 17, drive that systemic change that's going to take us forward.
Okay, and you will all recall that when I put up on the screen earlier, the alignment of the SDGs against the Sedex 4 pillars, I added a 5th line, which is Sedex's entire raison d'etre, which is partnership and collaboration. And what the Sedex community, I think, provides for is tens of thousands of organizations and millions of people who are in a position to start providing good news, good thoughts, good ideas. Like the Manufacture 2030 platform that Oliver's talked about, people can add their thoughts. Once we get this rolling, we're not just talking about one case study per SDG, we're trying to aim for a growing library, and then you can then all see what other people are doing, you can pick the best bits, and then we can see what works and what fails. So we can assist people in making the right choices and the right decisions and supporting delivery of the SDGs. So there's a big part for Sedex to play in this. The company that I work for, that I'm also representing on the panel, has a program. We're much smaller than Mondelez and P&G, but we have a similar program where we're working with people in our supply chain, and we have a stated goal that we would expect by 2025 to only be dealing with organizations that are like-minded. And maybe we change their minds, maybe we find other people who have a more aligned idea. So I've got the kill note from the lady on the front row here saying we have to pretty much wrap up. So one more last pithy comment, one key takeaway from you along the panel, starting with
just one last point on the companies that don't engage and don't share. In a world of beyond compliance, the ones that don't engage and don't share, go and audit them. The other thought is, and this is a very specific one, is in scorecard world, when you have gold, silver and bronze and all that sort of thing, add a criteria into gold that you have to share your best practice with the rest. It's interesting.
Thank you. Jonathan?
Since, I guess, to bring it back to Sedex, supplier partnership really matters. And there was a question there about from a supplier's perspective to a customer's perspective, and I think it's a fair challenge. And the answer to that question, I think, is don't address the customer's request for a label, address the underlying issue, and address it across your business as a whole. So, we keep saying to suppliers, don't provide us with something just because we're us and we want to be not guilty. Do something across the whole of your business, and that adds leverage.
And Andy.
My advice, if you want to integrate with the SDGs, but you're trying to figure out where to start, define where in your company or your organization you have unique platforms that are very specific to you, and figure out how you can link those platforms to the SDGs. For us, we're the world's biggest advertiser. How do we leverage that platform to drive the SDGs? It's going to be something different for all of you. That's the place to start.
Yeah.
Excellent. Right, okay, and I'm going to say, they say it, and say it again, so for probably the third time, submit your case studies, please. Contact your account manager. They'll put you in touch with Ellie, and on that basis, we can start developing this crowdsourced engagement with the SDGs and what people are doing in the real world. So that leaves me finally to say thank you to the panel, and if you could all show your appreciation for their contribution today. Thank you all for your time here, and I think up next